Welcome back to the channel. Today we're looking at the patch notes, which have kind of leaked early a little bit. So there was patch notes obviously last week, September 25th, but the French version of the Borderlands site have updated theirs to include buffs and nerfs to characters, because the patch that was supposed to come today has been pushed back till Thursday, probably at reset. So these are like the patch notes that look like they are coming. There are some that are still here from that 25th one, so like the weak activities, the stability and performance. These are all just the same as what we said on the 25th, but I'm just going to read out the character changes because that's the most important thing, right? So we're going to go straight down here to the rebalances and changes. We're going to start with Harlowe the Gravatar. So I haven't played much Harlowe, so this stuff alien to me, but I'm sure people out there will understand what I'm talking about. So Gravatar's climax fundamental state has been fixed to remove misinformation around the reduced damage taken by enemies when it is not. So the skill tree perk must have read something like enemies will take reduced damage, but they weren't. The Gravatar flow generator no longer heals enemies with potential transfer apogee. I'm pretty sure this was in last week's patch as well. Updated Gravatar passive stack to grant permanent health drain to allies. Fixed various reported issues with Gravatar's unstable energy pocket from the Chroma Accelerator action skill, and this patch includes fixes where the effect was not disappearing properly, not turning into ice damage as intended, or not distributing correctly with certain skill tree combinations. So there was a lot of lag around Harlowe and her big Gravatar ball, so maybe some of this is included in why it might lag. So, you know, interactions aren't working properly, so hopefully reduce lag. The skills affected by these updates are Augment, Special Magnets, Bright Light Apogee, CQFD passive, Icebreaker passive, Rift in Containment Augment, and Eureka passive. Gravatar balance changes, action skills 0 points, Stasis pounding damage is increased by 30%, Stasis resistance damage increased by 14.7%. Unfortunately, that's all that Harlowe gets. The big change is Amon, the Knight. It's insane the amount of changes that are happening here. So the Blacksmith's Knight Primal Leap passive now properly restores shield and ammo. I think this was in the 25th one as well. The Blacksmith Knight's Wall of Flame action skill has been changed so that Vengeance can no longer be activated by Wall of Flame until Scourge is activated as intended. Blacksmith Knight's Massacre Missile Punch now hits shielded enemies more regularly. Massacre Missile Punch, what a phrase to say. Fixed an issue where Blacksmith Knight's Blacksmith's Axe would not always detect nearby enemies. God, this is really testing my reading skills. But there's a whole bunch of changes for Amon. It makes me want to play him because I've heard there's good things here and there with his builds, but it sounds like he's going to be broken now, or at least brought up to everyone else's standards. So action skills, Scourge. Scourge has had his maximum Vengeance increased by 50%, allowing him to absorb more damage and deal more damage with Blacksmith's Whip when used, and the damage is increased by 27%. Then we go down to the Vengeance skill tree. Scorched Kairos now increases the damage of explosive weapons by 6% per point, up from 5% per point, so you're going to get a little bit of a boost there. Innate Warrior now increases weapon damage by 4% per point, up from 3%. Scar Tissue now increases the maximum health and health of the repair kit by 9% per point, up from 8%. Eternity now increases the duration of action skills by 5% per point, up from 4%. World Breaker damage is increased by 50%. Winter's Kiss now increases damage dealt by 10% per point, up from 8%. Anvil Strike now increases damage dealt by 15% per point, up from 12%. And Syncope electrical damage is now correctly proportional to the number of points invested. Syncope, I'm assuming it's Syncope. So all of these perks are just going up by 1 or 2%. The Anvil Strike goes up to 15%. If you put 5 points in Anvil Strike, you will get an extra 15% on top. So it really does look like Amon is going to be viable now and top form, not having to build one very specific build. There's going to be a lot of choices now. His Augment Vengeance skill tree. Glacial Breath damage is increased by 45%. Burning Reprimand damage is increased by 86%. The damage of the Eternal Winter Gigantic Wave is increased by 100%. Storm Spear damage is increased by 52%. And the Explosion damage is increased by 10%. This just sounds nuts. Haven't played much Amon, seen a bit of Amon, haven't really checked out his skills, but it sounds like he's going to be ridiculous now. The Apogee for Vengeance skill tree, the Cold Rapture Apogee now has a 60-second cooldown up from 70 seconds. So a quicker 10 seconds less, I should say. That's probably better English. Blacksmith's Whip Icy Rapture damage is increased by 16%. The damage of Fissure Glacial Rapture is increased by 41%. Wrathfall damage is increased by 46%. Action skills Crucible. Blacksmith's Axe damage is increased by 12%, which I've heard good things about the axes and how they work, so just getting extra damage with that is going to be insane. The damage of the double-edged Blacksmith's Twin Axe is increased by 10%. Then we get down into the Cybernetic skill tree, and as you can see, there's so much for aim and it's unbelievable. Thieving Storm now increases elemental damage by 3% per stack, up from 2. Executioner now increases critical damage by 4% per point, up from 3. Destructive Engine now increases Blacksmith Talent damage by 6% per point, up from 5. And the Explosion damage by 8% per point, up from 6. Blacksmith's Axe Tempered Pyre damage is increased by 19%. Blacksmith's Hammer Tempered Ice damage is increased by 18%. Why didn't they just make them the same? 19%, 18%. Just make them the same. Goldsmith's Work now increases the damage of Blacksmith's Drone by 10% per point, up from 7. That's a huge buff. And now increases the duration of Blacksmith's Drone by 8%, up from 5. So the little drone thing is going to get a huge buff. Blacksmith's Sword Muzzled Lightning damage is increased by 13%. Lightning Rod Elemental Bolt now deals 40% of the damage per point, up from 30%. So, you know, you're going to get an extra 50% damage there if you put 5 points in. Escalate now increases Blacksmith's Drone attack speed and movement speed by 5% per point, up from 3. Sharp Tip now increases Blacksmith's Drone's critical strike chance by 5% per point, up from 4. Heat Exchange now increases ice damage and incendiary damage by 8% per point, up from 7. So even like just the cybernetic skill tree, the drone and stuff is just getting absolutely buffed through the roof. The cybernetic skill tree augments Axe and Stone action skills cooldown restoration increased by 40%, up from 33. And the action skills explosive weapon restoration increased by 40%, up from 33. Infinite war hit damage increased by 20% per bounty stack, up from 15. Oh gosh. Blacksmith's Hammer Hour damage is increased by 14%. Blacksmith's Sword Storm damage increased by 13%. And the explosion damage is increased by 4%. More Apogees. Cybernetic sounds like it's getting insane buffs. Cripple Snow damage is increased by 38%. Storm Surge Impact damage is increased by 10%. Blacksmith's Storm Surge damage is increased by 60%. I think there's a couple of extra words in there, I don't know. The damage of the Blaster's Peak Fire Trail is increased by 100%. Action skills Massacre Shield regen increased by 15% per second, up from 10%. Massacre Missile Punch damage is increased by 78%. Magma Hammering has a 60-second cooldown instead of an 80-second cooldown, and Magma Hammer damage is increased by 50%. So every aspect of every tree and every skill and everything and passive skills are just getting buffed through the roof for Amon. We got the Calamity skill tree passive skills. Heavy Plate now increases maximum shield capacity by 7% per point, up from 6. And then we have Master of Storms now increases elemental effect chance and elemental effect duration by 7%, up from 6. Tritanium Fists now increase melee damage by 9% per point, up from 7. And now increase action skill damage by 6% per point, up from 3. So Tritanium Fists sound like they're getting a bit of a buff too. Herald now increases melee damage by 2% per stack, up from 1% per point. Well, stack points, I don't know what the difference is there. Judgment now increases melee damage by 10% per point, up from 8. We got the Augment Calamity skill tree. Frost Fall damage is increased by 71%. Fulminating Fist damage is increased by 69%. Apogees for the Calamity skill tree. Cold Razor has a 55-second cooldown, up from 65 seconds. Cold Razor damage is increased by 11%. Frost Slash explosion damage is increased by 18%. Magma Whirlwind has a 70-second cooldown instead of 80. Storm Slash now has a 65-second cooldown in 75% and an increased damage by 65%. Vex the Mermaid fixed an issue where Siren's Intense Harvest Augment would trigger when Incarnation was not activated. I'm pretty sure this was last week's as well. I think these, like, before we get to the balance changes, are the ones that we saw on September 25th. Fixed an issue with Siren's passive Degrading Affinity would sometimes not deal damage to the Timekeeper. Damage dealt by the Siren's Spirit Bomb passive is now properly counted as damage dealt by a sidekick, and its color now matches the affinity elements. But let's have a look at the balance changes. So action skills Incarnation, phase explosion damage is increased by 16.6% and phantom breath damage is increased by 9.5%. I'm very surprised that Vex is getting as many buffs as this, because it's obviously utterly broken with the critical damage, knife augments, penetrator augment. Like, I feel like they should have fixed that first and then changed the character, because all this doesn't matter if you're just going to use your crit knife. Passive skills, Intense Vex skill tree, Arcane Arts now increases action skill damage by 9% per point, up from 8. Intense Vex skill tree augment, Energy Hungry Vampire damage is increased by 25%. Apogee's Intense Vex skill tree, Heart Piercer damage is increased by 22%, Defile Hazard damage is increased by 50%, the damage of the Defile Flying Volley is increased by 48%, and Spectral Wave damage is increased by 41%. They really are trying to make everything strong, it's crazy. Action skills, Phasian? God knows how you pronounce that. This person's health is increased by 10% and the damage is increased by 21.9%. How would you say that? Micmac? Miakmac? I don't know. Passive skills, skill tree, It Smells Like Mayhem. Magic Blood now increases action skill damage by 8%, up from 7. And Claw and Smash now increases melee damage by 8%, up from 6. Then we got the skill tree, It Smells Like Mayhem augments. Violent Exaltation damage is increased by 12.5% and Vorpal Fang damage is increased by 34%. The Climaxes skill tree, It Smells Like Mayhem. Climaxes, I don't think I've seen this word in game. Is this supposed to be capstones? But because it's translated from French, it's not going, like it's not translating properly. I don't know. The bubble damage is increased by 33%. Passive skills, Fourth Seal skill tree. Cruel Inscriptions melee damage is increased by 7% per point, up from 6%. Recurrence now increases melee damage by 0.2% per stack, up from 0.16%. The damage of Dagger Haruspice phase is increased by 11.7%. It's actually just came to my mind that a lot of these skills or names might translate a bit different. Hopefully these make sense to people. Rafa the Exo Soldier. So fix an issue that prevented liquidation passive from stacking properly when repeating action skills. I believe that was there on the 25th. So action skills, Electric Blades. Electric Blades really need some love. There's a couple of like really ridiculous builds, but you have to have very specific items and swap them around during a fight. But melee attack damage being increased by 12% makes me want to play Rafa. Sprint damage is increased by 5%, so moving around quicker, that makes sense. Passive skills, the Extraversion skill tree. Elegance. Critical damage is increased by 8% per point, up from 7. Bonus electrical damage increased by 8% per point, up from 7. And a little reminder, double damage chances increased by 6% per point, up to 5. And then we have the last little bit for Rafa. Passive skills, the LTM skill tree. So hand games, melee damage is increased by 9% per point, up from 7. To the last, action skill damage is increased by 8% per point, up from 6. Umbrella, splash damage increased by 9% per point, up from 7. Execution, damage is increased by 50%. Explosive Collaboration, bonus damage increased by 8%, up from 6. Synergy, the duration has been increased by 14 seconds, up from 12 seconds. It's been increased by 14 seconds, or to 14 seconds. I wonder what that's actually going to be. Melee damage increased by 4% per point, up from 3. And Frost, action skill duration increased by 7% per point, up from 6%. So there are some like gameplay stuff here. I'm going to leave it on screen for a second if you want to just pause and read through it, because I think a lot of this stuff is already known. And then we'll do the hardware stuff as well. I think this is new. But yeah, there's a lot of other things here that don't really care about. Like, these were definitely in on the 25th, so I think a lot of these are. If you haven't seen these or you think there's anything new here, have a little pause and have a little read. But I'm happy to see that already, since the game has come out, they are making balance changes, and it doesn't look like they're just nerfing everything. It looks like they're really trying to make their Vault Hunters very, very powerful. The only problem is, for me, with things like the Songbird and the Vladoff SMGs and the underbarrels and, you know, the crit knife, all these things make all builds completely irrelevant. Yes, you don't have to use them, I get it, but at the end of the day, most people are going to use them because they are broken. So while, you know, they shouldn't already nerf absolutely everything into the ground, I feel like they should have probably done at least both of them together so that you can forget all your overpowered stuff and then work on the new builds. So it's an interesting decision, but it sounds like there's a lot of cool builds that can be made now, especially with Amon. Amon sounds like he's going to be an animal. I'm going to have to start learning how to play him. Let me know what you think about your character and the changes. So yeah, I hope that this made sense with the translations and stuff, but I don't see any English patch notes anywhere, so I decided to do this one. So let me know what you think down below. Thank you for watching. I've been easy now. You guys have been awesome.